Hi everyone. I'm excited to be here with you at the ProductLed Summit today and to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I think it's often misunderstood by both marketers and founders alike. And this topic is brand tone of voice. What's tone of voice? How do you define your brand's voice? And how to actually do it in a way that's actionable and useful to you in the long run? And it doesn't become just like a random branding exercise that you do one day and then you just shove in a Google Drive folder somewhere and never look at again. My name is Vasilena Volchanova, and I'm a content marketing and conversion rate optimization expert. I help brands create meaningful relationships with their customers, where tone of voice actually plays a pretty large role. And I help my customers scale those relationships through digital channels. And if you want to learn more about me, you can go to my website, volchanova.me, or just connect with me on social media. I'm active on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to see you there virtually. So let's dive right in. Let's start talking about tone of voice. And some of the brands that usually pop to mind when we talk about tone of voice are brands like Innocent Drinks. They have a very fun, very fresh approach. You can even see it right off the bat on their homepage when you look at this banner, which can't really fit all the good stuff that they put in their drinks. Or you might think of another brand that's a bit different, maybe more aggressive and rebellious, like Brewdog craft beer. They even show their brand's distinct voice in their product copy. So you here see phrases like explosion of flavor or bursts of caramel and tropic fruit or a spiky bitter finish. So it's much more manly, much more aggressive. But obviously, if we're looking at those very common examples online, we might start thinking about it if this is actually even applicable to a digital product. Do we need a brand tone of voice in a situation where a lot of customers would mainly be focusing on features and on product sets? And I would definitely say yes, because we all know that we are not these perfect, fully logical creatures, and we rely a lot on emotion. And when we're interacting with a tool, we don't just think about the features and the way we can complete our customer job to be done with the tool in question. We actually look at the product and we try to um, get a sense of connection, feel that we're talking to someone in particular, feel that we're working with a partner rather than just a tool. And you probably have heard this phrase of Maya Angelou that people don't remember what you say or even what you do, but how you made them feel. And this is actually the place where tone of voice does a lot of work for us as brands. So even if you're in B2B, even if you're focusing fully on a digital product, you definitely need to consider your brand's tone of voice and to actually be mindful about this tone of voice and work on it specifically. But why? Why do we need this? Well, first off, it helps you set yourself apart from the competition. And in this highly competitive world that we live in today, it's very important to not just swim in a sea of sameness, but show some character, show some personality. Brand tone of voice helps you humanize your product, helps you humanize your brand, and showcase your culture. And I think that's especially important for digital products where we mostly interact with our customers in a digital environment where we're a bit impersonal. They don't see us, they don't necessarily know who's standing behind the product. And brand tone of voice actually creates a sense that they're talking to a real human being. When these product interactions happen for customers in a way that's interesting, in a way that's more emotionally charged, customers are more likely to remember that interaction. And this familiarity helps build trust. The more often we connect with a product, and the more often we actually remember we've connected with them, the more trustworthy they look in our mind. And finally, there's this principle that was put out first by Robert Cialdini in his book Influence. And he says that people are persuaded more easily when they like the person they're talking to or the brand they're talking to in this case. So when your brand tone of voice actually works with your customer audience, actually shows them a personality that's likable for them and that they can connect with in a meaningful sense, then your job of persuading people to continue this relationship, to continue using your product, is much easier, let's say. So let's look at a very basic example, a 404 error. A person comes to your website and they don't find what they're looking for. This is really a situation where your brand's voice can really shine and it can really help you connect with the customer on the other end of the screen. And there's no one approach that's valid for everyone. You might go in a more professional, more smart direction, like what Active Campaign are doing here. So they're very clear on what's happening. It's a very concise message that's almost devoid of like any very deep emotion. They're straight to the point, they're matter of fact, and they're very professional about it. They add a bit of character with the visual on the side. But you can also go at the other end of the spectrum and be very quirky, very weird, very extravagant even. And this is what MailChimp are doing. They say we lost this page. If you click on the horse who's looking in a hole at the bottom of the page, you even get a game that starts playing in your browser. So neither Active Campaigns nor MailChimp's approach is better than the other, but it shows how products that are very complex and that can be considered competitors in certain cases actually differentiate from the competition just based on the style of communication they use. So let's dive right in. Let's see what we need to do in order to convey our own tone of voice and to actually start working on connecting with our audience based on our tone of voice. The first place we can start with is gathering data, doing some initial research. And this has to be done through several different channels or through several different sources of information, if you want to call them. You first want to look inside your company and internally within your team. The one place you might want to start with would be looking at your values and mission. So, how do your values inform what your tone of voice needs to look like? Depending on the values that you have, you probably get a feeling whether your brand needs to be a bit more rebellious or a bit more relaxed, a bit more professional or a bit more friendly, and so on and so forth. And this is actually the best place where you can start with, because if there's a disconnect between your values and your tone of voice, your job communicating those values to an external audience would be that much harder. The second place where you can look is your existing content. Probably even without thinking about it, your content has already started shaping a tone that's consistent with your brand. This is not always the case, but if it is, you might want to consider that existing tone and actually try to not go in a completely different direction from it, but rather evolve it and make it more impactful and more meaningful. And the third internal resource you'll definitely want to look at is just your internal conversation. How does your team communicate just between yourselves, like on Slack or within internal email message chains? This is a weird place to look at if you just start thinking about it from the get-go. But it's actually a great resource of ideas because what you see is that it's very hard to create a brand tone of voice that's completely separate from your team culture. And the closer your tone of voice is to your existing team culture, the easier it will be to maintain that tone of voice and to really make it work for you. So if you consider your internal style of communication, my advice would be to keep your brand's tone of voice as close to that as possible and just strengthen it and really build it into an asset of your own. But we also need to look outside of the company, of course. And the first thing that we might want to consider is our audience. What is likely to resonate with our target audience? How do those people already communicate between themselves? And you might want to look at online communities like LinkedIn groups or Slack communities or whatever it might be, places where your audience gathers, and just try to look at the conversations happening there and understand what's deemed a good style of communication. What do people actually resonate with? What are the type of words they use themselves? Are they more formal? Are they more informal? Is there like a culture of snarky comments happening there, and so on and so forth? And consider staying as close to your audience's native tongue as possible. The next thing you might want to consider are your competitors. I wouldn't necessarily start from this point, but you need to take it into account when you're building your tone of voice because you don't want to just look like a carbon copy of an existing brand that's already out there and doing a good job at keeping a consistent voice. So don't start with your competitors, I'd say, but keep them in mind just so you know that you're occupying a blank space, that you're not stepping on someone's toes, that you don't just look like you stole their character altogether. Another thing you might want to consider are the channels where you're active. Obviously, you will need to vary your tone a bit from channel to channel. And a great example of this might be Nike, for example. Their communication that's going out to direct customers is very motivating, it's very strong, it's very energetic. They keep a very consistent tone throughout their different channels, but on LinkedIn, they don't necessarily go all the way to where their Instagram communication is at. But they talk about leadership, about motivation, about internal company stories that actually present this sense of motivating others. So while they're still keeping to their core brand personality, they're modifying their tone depending on the channel. And the last thing you might want to consider are local specifics. If you're present on a lot of different markets or you want to sound native to a lot of different locations, you might want to consider that. And here I'm not talking about localizing content in a different language. I'm just saying that saying awesome in the US doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as saying awesome if you're speaking to people from France, for example. Awesome in the US often means run of the mill, while we Europeans are much more careful when going into superlatives. So you need to keep in mind these local specifics, and you might want to work with local advisors or local consultants or just some people from your team who are native to that specific region and see what's important to them and how your voice needs to be reimagined for that specific location. The next thing that we're going to look at is obviously to dig a bit deeper. And to do that, I usually get a lot of people in the same room and do a bunch of exercises with them to make sure that we know what our tone of voice needs to sound like. You will already need to have done your preliminary research to just to know where the edges are, but going a bit deeper with the help of specific tone of voice exercises can uncover and help you really explain what tone of voice your brand needs to use in the future. One challenge that we often see is that tone of voice is a very fickle thing. Like you can't really talk about, let's say, a person and say, oh, they are this and this and that, and just enumerate a bunch of adjectives that describes that person in a whole. In the same sense, if you even if you have a very good idea of what you want your brand's tone of voice to be, it might be hard to verbalize that to an external audience or even to your internal team. So the way to do that is through some exercises. And I've added here three of my favorites. You will see some other ideas in the resources I have at the end of the presentation. The first and probably the easiest exercise I like to do is the personality sliders. This is an exercise that I came across in GV, Google Ventures 3-hour brand sprint. This is a whole framework of defining a brand within 3 hours, which is very powerful and very cool. So here I've adapted a bit the brands that are at the end of each line just to make sure that they're consistent with what my clients usually know in terms of brands, but you can also see the original in the files I'll share with you at the end. So the way this exercise goes is pretty simple. You look at each slider and you try to think where you want your brand to be at. What you might also want to do is mark where your brand currently is and where you want it to get to, or even add a couple of your main competitors just for the sake of making sure that you're different at least on one or two of the sliders compared to the main ones, the main competitors you have. So let's take an example. This first one, we have elite versus mass appeal. I don't think that any brand would be right at the end of any one of those lines, really. But you will want to be somewhere that's as far from the middle point as possible. Like the worst thing you can do here is to just keep all of your dots at the center of each slider. That's not really a brand. That's just a robot talking to a person, you know. So there might be a lot of different reasons why you might want your brand to be at one part of the spectrum compared to the other. And you can discuss this internally. And actually, the most interesting part of this exercise is not just finally putting the slider somewhere, but talking to your team and discussing with them what are the reasons why you want to put the slider at a very specific position. The second exercise I selected here goes a bit deeper and it starts from a very similar place as the personality sliders of Google, but this is an exercise created based on Nielsen-Norman Group's work on tone of voice. And I think that this might be even probably the best exercise to start with for product teams specifically because as you probably know, Nielsen Norman Group focuses a lot on UX, and the examples that they give when they're talking about tone of voice are very applicable to product copy in particular. So you might want to look at this as a starting point and actually go from here. Again, they use four different sliders, let's call them, for different voice dimensions. And you don't have like such an elaborate use as the previous one. You just say like if you're on one end of the spectrum or on the other end of the spectrum or in the neutral central position. You might remain neutral on, let's say, two of the four, but I wouldn't recommend doing that for most of them. And this exercise actually goes a step further and lets you add for each of the four dimensions a couple of tone of voice ingredients, let's call them, a couple of words that actually explain what you mean when you say like you want to be formal. You don't just want to be formal for the sake of being very, let's say, professional, but you want to be formal for the sake of being more trustworthy. And in this sense, you're taking this basic scale and you're making it a lot more specific. You're making it a lot more imbued with meaning, which is something I really like about this exercise. So here's an example. This is actually the voice dimensions that I've created for my own personal brand. So let's take the second one, for example, serious versus funny. I actually chose neutral because I actually want to have elements from both of those sides. So I want to be humorous, but I also want to write in an informative way. My blog posts need to convey a lot of additional information to people. So that's where we take this very uninformative neutral position. Like it doesn't tell you a lot if you just look at the scale here. But when you look at the characteristics, so they're like, oh, okay, I now know what this actually means. And you can use these words and include them in your final brand tone of voice document, which I'm gonna get to in a bit. The third exercise, it goes a bit deeper, and I wouldn't have like a ton of time to go through the details of that one, but I'm gonna again add additional resources to that. But I really like the concept of brand archetypes because I feel that when we talk about brand archetypes, we really talk about brand personality. We're talking about something that's deeper within the brand than just the way it talks. It's about the way we want to act, about what we believe in as a whole. And I think that this exercise will give you the most detail when it comes to why your brand needs to act in a certain way or talk in a certain way. So these archetypes that you're gonna see here, they are actually a very old concept. They are devised for the sake of um, psychology, and they were first defined by Carl Jung. And he defined 12 archetypes. He wasn't talking about branding at all, but he defined 12 archetypes which are common among almost all cultures and among all peoples. So, what he tried to explain was that if you use one of these archetypes, it will be very easy for people to understand where you're coming from. And this is actually the main benefit of this concept. I won't go through all of them in detail, but what you're going to see here in the slides are the four categories of archetypes. Each of the four categories has three specific archetypes within it. And I'm just going to go on the high picture level, and I hope that I'm going to let you understand and want to continue discussing this concept further once you finish watching this presentation. So the first category is the category of freedom motivated brands. So these are brands that try to go across boundaries. They want to be as free as possible, and they can achieve that freedom in a lot of different ways. For example, freedom through knowledge, learning a lot, which is the archetype of the sage, which is very common for media brands, for example, or for media products, or the concept of achieving freedom through action, through activity, through purposefully going the extra mile, which are most commonly brands that have to do with active lifestyle, like sportswear or Red Bull that you see here, for example. The second category are ego motivated brands. So these are the brands that are motivated by the will to leave a mark on the world, to have a meaningful um, impact on the world around them. And this can be impact that's kind of more in line with the status quo, and that's trying to be helpful and building on top of existing notions like the hero archetype. Or it can be a brand that's trying to go beyond the existing status quo and challenge that, like the outlaw archetype. The third category are social motivated brands. So these are brands that are trying to connect with others, and that's their main will and their end goal. And these are often brands that have to do with a lot of positive experiences. They're trying to be very joyful, very, very happy, very lovable. And these are commonly brands that play on the concept of humor, like the Jester, or play on the concept of just being for everyone out there. And this concept of the everyman archetype might be very applicable if you're building a product that has to appeal to a very wide audience. And the final category are order motivated brands. So those are the brands that try to provide structure to the world. Now, they're similar to the ego brands, but they're more focused on building, on creating around them. And I really, really love creator brands. And here you see Lego, and that's one of my definite favorites when it comes to tone of voice. Or we can talk about more caring brands, like the caregiver archetype, which has to do with a lot of cosmetics brands, for example. So this concept of brand archetypes, it is a bit harder to grasp, but there are easy ways to understand it in more detail, be it through examples, which is the main benefit of looking at those colorful photos here, or it can be done by reading a bit more about the concept. And it doesn't require a ton of preliminary preparation, just one skilled moderator who can help people express what they want to see in their own brand within their own company. What you need to remember here is that no brand is like just one of those archetypes in full. And what I like to do, and the way I try to work with clients when we do these brand exercises, is to think of a primary archetype and to think of two or maximum three secondary archetypes where we just want to use them for one of their main qualities. So you don't need to just focus on one. It's not like where it's not like your astrological sign is the only thing out there. You also have like a moon sign that's adding to your personality and to the complexity with it. So this is somewhat similar, but I'm going to say a bit more helpful than your horoscope would be. And the final step here is to actually put that to use. So you've done a bunch of research, you've done a bunch of exercises, and you and your team have collectively defined what you want your brand to sound like. But how do you actually put that to good use? How do you actually use that in your everyday? The easiest way to do that is to create a brand voice chart and to have that permeated throughout the company and to have that present on every person who's working in some form of communicating with the outside world. And this very simple chart, it looks like this, like the example you see here. And for each of the voice characteristics that you may be defined with the second exercise I presented, the Nielsen-Norman group one, you might want to add a description of why that characteristic is significant, and along with a couple of do's and don'ts. And I think that this part, the examples bit, is the most useful to people in their everyday work. You want to say what you want to be, but you also just as much want to say what you don't want to be and what you don't want your brand to sound like. If you want to go a bit further than that, you can create a full brand style guide where you would also focus on your tone of voice. There's a lot of great examples out there. MailChimp's content style guide is probably the most popular and the one that's like most detailed. But you also see in the resources that you see on my website, you also see, for example, Uber or Microsoft, or even the health government of the UK's style guide, which is also pretty decent. So you can look at style guides online and get some additional inspiration on what you can include in order to really codify what you want your tone of voice to be. And the final element of this is just to make it some about the different contexts. So you don't want to talk about your tone of voice in general. Actually, there's sometimes a differentiation between brand voice and brand tone, where brand voice is your overall unchanging personality when it comes to communication, while your tone is specific to a situation. And this is what you might also want to include in this file. On top of your brand voice chart, for example, you might want to add a couple of scenarios for different contexts and how that voice can differ a bit when it comes to marketing content compared to when it comes to replying to a customer service request, for example. Obviously, these will be different, but they still need to sound on brand uh, and at the same time be mindful of the context where you're presenting the information in. And the best way to make sure that this doesn't just stay on paper is to have what I'll call a chief voice officer, someone who pays attention to how your brand communicates and does a quick check before you publish something, at least in the first couple of months of actually using your standard brand voice. So this is the person who does like your final editorial review and says if your content passes or doesn't based on your defined tone of voice. And I think with these three steps, it's easy to start and to start thinking about a tone of voice that differentiates you from competitors, that makes people feel that they're more connected with you, and that elicits a very specific emotional response. I hope this has been useful to you, and I would be happy to hear your feedback on tone of voice, on your experience with it so far, or on your experience with the exercises I just presented. You will find all the templates and some additional materials on my website, volchanova.me/product-led. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope we can connect in the future. Bye.